Guia de estilo e instruções para síntese de fala. Início das instruções. Comece com energia total e um tom de comando, capturando a atenção imediatamente. The knock came at dawn. 3 soft, steady raps that sounded like someone testing whether the house would answer. I knew the rhythm of this place long before the sun cleared the horizon. The ocean sent a thin hiss through the windows. The kettle had its own clock. My keys lay on the little ceramic dish by the door, and I would not be surprised by much. That morning, I was surprised anyway. Before I open the rest, stay with me to the end, subscribe if you want more stories like this, and drop where you're listening from in the comments. It helps knowing who else is watching. Sophia stood in the hallway, hair still damp from sleep, a bag slung over one shoulder, and a man 3 steps behind her who smiled like he owned the light. He had the polite kind of confidence people mistake for kindness, enough charm to make you hand him the sugar without asking. I had never met him. "Mom," she said, voice small in the huge house. "This is Derek. He's my husband." They had announced their engagement by text 3 weeks earlier. That had been a picture of 2 glasses and a ring that caught the light. They had never mentioned marriage in the conversation that lived between my laundry list and my crossword answers. Little surprises are fine. Sophia's impulsive streak had been the only thing about her I never tried to fix. But waking me up at dawn with a man at my threshold was a surprise of a different grade. "You're early," I said, and the kettle was already moving in my head. Coffee, eggs, the way my hands knew the rhythm of a morning. My house was a shoreline of rituals. Keys, coffee, yoga mat on the deck. This was how I marked a day as mine. "Can he stay?" Sophia asked, and the question landed like a small stone. It shouldn't have been a stone. It should have been a request. Instead, it carried the faint echo of entitlement that would later unspool into everything else. Just for a few nights, we didn't have anywhere else to go. Derek fetched the smallest cup of charm and poured it over me. "We thought we could sleep on the couch just until we sort the new apartment." He set his bag down with a careful flourish, as if he had practiced making himself at home. My kitchen never took to strangers well. It knew when something would be out of place. I made coffee anyway. I always made coffee. The smell filled the kitchen like a preface. Sophia hovered over the island. Derek watched me pour, asked about the house with the casual interest of someone who knew how to steer conversation into a compliment. "The view is something else," he said. He had an expensive watch, the sort of thing men wear when they want to say they've arrived. I noticed its face, the light catching like a lie. Breakfast became the first battlefield. "He likes eggs over easy," Sophia said. She said it like someone rehearsed. He asked about the spare room. "We'll be out of the way," he promised. He smiled and said things that were too easy. He opened drawers as if he'd earned the right. My kitchen never took to strangers well. It knew when something would be out of place. I made coffee anyway. I always made coffee. The smell filled the kitchen like a preface. Sophia hovered over the island. Derek watched me pour, asked about the house with the casual interest of someone who knew how to steer conversation into a compliment. "The view is something else," he said. He had an expensive watch, the sort of thing men wear when they want to say they've arrived. I noticed its face, the light catching like a lie. Breakfast became the first battlefield. "He likes eggs over easy," Sophia said. She said it like someone rehearsed. He asked about the spare room. "We'll be out of the way," he promised. He smiled and said things that were too easy. He opened drawers as if he'd earned the right. guia de estilo e instruções para síntese de fala. Você é um narrador palestrante com voz potente, forte e autoritária. O tom deve ser firme e inabalável. A frase anterior era: He opened drawers as if he'd earned the right. Você está no meio de uma frase-pensamento, mantenha o ritmo e a força vocal, sem quebrar a conexão. Haja como se estivesse transmitindo uma verdade fundamental. It should have been small. It was small at first. A mismatched coaster, a used toothbrush that made my jaw tighten. But small things in a house accumulate. They create a map where trust used to be. After they left, "We'll sort the apartment Monday," they said. I sat at my table and listened to the ocean argue with the shore. I made a list. Keys, alarm codes, bills. The house had survived storms. People had survived storms. I prided myself on being quiet with damage. I repaired things without fanfare, but something about the morning lodged like a shard. When the first oddity showed up on my porch, a folded note, polite and careful, left beneath the breadbasket, it was a small thing too. A business card slipped between the pages of a magazine. Little breadcrumbs that taste like someone telling a story they think you won't read. The card announced Derek's investment consultancy with a phone number that carried the sort of punctuation I hadn't seen in lines of honest work. He'd mentioned work in passing, a project, nothing concrete. It put a name to the gloss. I started, predictably and quietly, to check things. Public records, the way property histories glint in government repositories, foreclosure notices that live in the past like a second skin. I called a couple of numbers, formal, polite calls, left messages for people I thought deserved a heads up. The pattern I began to trace did not exist because I wanted to find it. It existed because patterns have a way of leaving tracks even when predators think they've been careful. Jennifer Walsh answered on the third try. She spoke like someone who'd been practiced at restraint. "You'd be surprised how many of us have the same story," she said. Her voice tightened around the words ex-wife. She told me, slowly, how the man I'd just made coffee for had once been very good at promising stability and very good at disappearing when Bills did the honest work of showing a different face. Jennifer came to coffee a week later with 2 bruises of grief and 1 clenched envelope of bank statements that didn't add up. She became an ally before she realized she had to be. Eleanor Patterson came next, an older woman who smelled of talcum and pennies, who sat in my kitchen and wept with the quiet of someone who had been betrayed by the one person she believed in. She had trusted and shut her door to strangers because faith felt cheaper than mistrust. She had been too polite to refuse a hand to hold, and that politeness had been counted upon. Her account was different from mine, but threaded in the same fabric. Someone who'd once been someone's other half, and now found herself outside a life that had been quiet but honest. I kept notes in a thin notebook, the kind with a spiral that eventually gives in to too much thumbing. I wrote down the time he arrived, the way he tilted his head when telling a story, the brands he referenced like breadcrumbs of the life he wanted you to believe. They did not promise miracles. They promised structure, subpoenas, and the kind of institutional patience that moves like a glacier and sometimes with the light of justice on its face. They asked me the questions you expect in a report: dates, conversations, what was said at breakfast. They asked for the business card, the breadcrumb notes. They did not need my panic. They needed the facts. "We can't promise a particular outcome," Agent Martinez said, "but we can promise to investigate and to proceed as the evidence allows." What followed was a series of small, legally bound movements: interviews, a formal complaint, an initial assessment by a forensic accountant who looked for the pattern in the paper trail. Harold sat at my kitchen table, hunched over spreadsheets with his reading glasses low on his nose, translating odd transfers into a story. "There's a string here," he said. "It's not returned to a single person, it jumps." He tapped a line with a pen. "That often signals a network." The word network is colder than betrayal. A network means this was not merely one man's appetite. It meant there were methods, still usable scripts, and rehearsed calls, victims who might not even know they'd been targeted until they had nothing left to lose. It meant that the small things in my house, keys, the spare room, my daughter's softness, were not random flukes, but opportunities counted and exploited. Sophia reacted in the way children of the bewildered do, with guilt and with defense. She wanted to defend him at first, and I understood. Love makes us blind, and children who have learned mercy wear it like armor. But as more names and faces surfaced, Jennifer's statements, Eleanor's tears, a neighbor who remembered a man at a fundraiser who'd asked too many questions, Sophia's armor softened. She began to see the outlines of what I had suspected: a man who had practiced ease in other people's kitchens. We became a small, awkward team. I would not say we were bound by anything noble at first. It was mostly necessity and the humbling feeling that the world had shifted under our feet. We learned to sit across from the agents without flinching. We learned to hand over passwords and spare keys and the little permissions you give to living fools who mean no harm, and the big permissions you give to institutions that wear badges. Agent Chen explained, simply and without drama, the limits and the tools the Bureau could use: surveillance, subpoenas, monitor transactions. He asked me to be careful, to keep my house as unchanged as possible, and to document any contact. The house felt both more alive and more fragile then. The keys on the ceramic dish seemed suddenly like totems. I counted them like prayers, one by one. The alarm that had always been a background hum became a promise I checked twice a day. The ocean kept its indifferent rhythm, and I leaned on it when I could not lean on anything else. There were other victims. Agent Kim brought names, some redacted, some willing to speak. We met in coffee shops that smelled of burnt beans and slow conversation, the kind of public rooms that make conspiracies feel less dramatic. Eleanor's hands trembled less when she found community. Jennifer read her testimony out loud to us once, words lined like veins that carried an anger we could not deny. "He took more than money," she said quietly. "He took the sense you had of what's private." As pieces assembled, a picture emerged. Derek's charm was currency. He had a way of asking favors, of making needs sound reasonable. He knew how to plant the idea that the house could be better off if it were simplified, that closing one account might ease the burden of another. He had been practiced at counting on people's reluctance to check. And where he could not move a trunk with a promise, he relied on partners who could do the rest. I began to understand why so many victims resist the step of telling their stories. Shame, embarrassment, the fear of looking foolish. I understood why some told themselves that the gift was love or the sale was convenience. Predators do not announce themselves as predators. They arrive with roses and sincerity. They arrive at dawn. When Agent Martinez said the investigation would need cooperation from the financial institutions and that a sting might be planned, my breath tightened. They emphasized that any plan would be by the book. If we can get enough to implicate him, Agent Kim said, we'll move. For now, we assess, we preserve, and we follow the evidence. There is a peculiar kind of patience required in watching an investigation build. It's not cinematic. It is paperwork, authorization forms, waiting rooms, and the small, steady work of testimony. It is also the slow healing that begins in the cracks. Sophia's apology that sounded like truth for the first time. Jennifer's comfortable anger that turned into testimony. Eleanor's reclaiming of a morning routine. And then Derek's return happened on a Tuesday night, in the gray hour where day hasn't quite given up and the ocean's voice becomes deeper. I was in bed when I heard the creak at the back door. The house breathed differently. I could tell because the floorboards remembered each step I'd ever taken. I sat up. The alarm flashed, a quiet promise. I reached for my phone without thinking. I can still see the way the deck light threw him into relief when he emerged from the shadow. Tall, steady, the man who had once smiled in my kitchen. He must have thought the night would help keep him bold. He did not know the house had witnesses now, not only wood and salt air, but cameras and agents and people who cared enough to keep secrets until they could weaponize them for justice. I kept the blinds closed like a secret between me and the bed. My heart shuffled, then steadied. This was the moment the agents had warned me might come. I whispered into the phone because in the dark, the world requires vows. They're here, I said. He's back. The voice on the other end was calm, the sort of calm that's been trained by patience. Stay where you are, Agent Chen said. Do not engage. We're on our way. In the dark, the house felt small and full of lightless things. The ocean was a distant drum. I thought of eggs on the stove, of coffee cups, of the way Derek had asked for the spare room, as if there were not a history in my rafters. I thought of the spiral notebook, the lines of paper that had become testimony. I thought of every woman who had sat at my table and found herself tender and led away from her own compass. They told me later that Derek had tried to get inside, that there had been a standoff when agents filled the yard like water filling a bowl. They told me later how lights went out and then on again, how shadow and revelation played against one another. For that night, all I knew was the sound of my own breathing and the hush of agents stepping into what I had always called my sanctuary. When the banging finally stopped and voices, firm, legal, not theatrical, moved through the rooms, I felt a relief so precise it hurt. I opened the bedroom door to find Agent Kim standing at the threshold, Agent Martinez at his shoulder, Agent Chen with a small notebook. They were professional and steady. "You're safe," Agent Kim said. It wasn't a promise of no future trouble. It was a fact about that moment. They arrested him that night. They read him his rights with a patience I envy. He looked at me with the same polite expression he'd used at breakfast, as if disappointed that he had been interrupted in his plans. The look of a man who expected the world to bend for him. But the law had bent in another way, and in that bend there was a kind of justice that is less romantic and more methodical. Evidence was gathered. Items were taken under warrant. Agents moved through my house like gardeners clearing a beached net. What surprised me was not the seizure, but the professional tenderness with which they handled photographs and letters. The way someone gently wrapped Eleanor's old bank statements as if they were heirlooms. They cataloged, they listened, they told me not to throw anything away. When they led him out in handcuffs, Derek's watch caught the porch light like a lie confessed. The neighbors had come to the fence in pajamas and robes, faces turned toward the small theater of consequence. Sophia stood on the deck, her hands in the pockets of her robe. Her face was an atlas of things she'd only just begun to read. The morning after, the house felt like a reclaimed room. The locks were changed with official keys. Agents explained what would come next: interviews, federal charges for interstate fraud, coordination with other districts. They did not promise a perfect outcome. They promised to do their job. Looking back, the thing that carried me through was not the arrest. It was the work that followed, the testimony that demanded honesty, the careful recounting of breakfasts and nights, the way Sophia learned to say, "I was wrong," and mean it. It was Jennifer standing in a courtroom with a voice that no longer shook. It was Eleanor opening her front door again and deciding to keep it closed only to the wrong people. I could, if I wanted, stop there and let the story tidy itself into a neat before and after. But real life seldom respects neatness. The federal case widened. Other names surfaced. Agents Martinez and Chin discovered links that went beyond a single household. Harold Manning's spreadsheets became exhibits. Depositions peeled back layers of transactions and conversations until the outline of a network emerged like a silhouette against an honest light. The house remained, but it was altered. Keys had been replaced, not because I feared the world, but because I had learned the value of a boundary. I learned how to speak in depositions with a voice that balanced detail and restraint. When Jennifer took the stand, she kept her head high and did not shrink from the truth. Eleanor, too, testified with a steadier cadence than I had expected. We all learned how to be witnesses without becoming spectacles. And me? I took the anger and welded it to purpose. I sat with the agents, with Harold, and with a woman from a nonprofit that supports victims of financial elder abuse. They asked me if I would share my experience in local seminars, if I would speak to neighborhood groups. I started small: coffee hours at the community center, a talk at the senior center where I knew women who had been too polite to refuse. They listened. They had lived too many quiet compromises. The work changed me from someone who tended a house to someone who tended a cause. It was not heroism. It was a kind of practical stubbornness, the decision to use my story so that someone else's morning would not begin the way mine had. The FBI asked me to consult on training modules. I taught them what it meant to feel invaded without a visible wound. I showed them the small signs that people dismiss because they don't want to look foolish. A man who always pays for a little favor and smiles. A woman who forgets to check bank statements because it's painful. A neighbor who sees someone come and go. There were hearings, there were restitution calculations that were never perfect, and victims who would spend years getting back to a place of comfort. There were victories, too. People recognized the pattern earlier. An elderly couple avoided a sale that would have stripped their savings. A bank flagged an account because a pattern fit like a glove. The net widened. Sophia and I rebuilt mornings together. We cooked eggs and learned how to talk to one another without assuming malice or denying it. She learned to apologize in public and in private. She learned that love without accountability is not love at all. When the trial finally began, the courtroom felt like a theater of consequence. The prosecution presented a mosaic: bank records, witness statements, patterns stitched together with patient care. Derek's defense argued interpretation and misreading. The jury took time. Months later, The verdict was reached, guilty on several counts, a sentence that would not erase what had been taken, but would, at least, be a public accounting. The sting, the arrest, the trial, these were not the end so much as the hinge into what came next. I worked with the agents on outreach projects, sat on panels, and when I could, testified about the texture of predation, not the how, but the why and the consequence. I spoke to financial advisors about making compassionate but firm checks. I sat with nonprofit directors and tried to translate feeling into procedure. I learned, in public, how to be both survivor and citizen. There are small reminders in the house. The ceramic dish still holds keys. The alarm chirps once in the evening like a metronome. The ocean is still indifferent, but when I stand on the deck with coffee in my hand, it no longer feels like it is watching me make poor decisions. It feels like a witness to the way ordinary people can sometimes turn an invasion into a common defense. If anything came from that broken dawn, it was a rearrangement of meaning. The house remained what it had always been, salt air, sunlight, a place to lay your head. But I reclaimed its narrative. I taught neighbors to check in on each other. I sat with Eleanor at her kitchen table and figured out what rent she could afford with dignity. I wrote letters to legislators with Agent Martinez's help, advocating for clearer reporting requirements and better support for elder victims. Small things became scaffolding. And Derek, he serves time. He will no longer stroll into kitchens unaired by consequence. His partners were investigated. Some pled guilty. Some fights still drag in courtrooms. The network did not evaporate overnight, but people stopped letting it move in unchallenged. There are nights when I wake early and the house remembers that knock. I make coffee and think of the small beginnings of things that change you. I think of Sophia, who used the same hands that once fetched a toast to now distribute flyers for community workshops. I think of Jennifer and Eleanor, of Harold and the agents, of the way strangers knit into allies. If you or someone you know has sat at a kitchen table and felt the polite pressure of a too easy favor, document, call someone, don't let shame bury a theft. Talk to your bank, talk to the police, talk to people who will listen. You do not need to be brave alone. If this story touched you or made you think of someone, please subscribe, share this with someone who needs to hear it, and tell us where you're listening from in the comments. Share your stories if you feel safe doing so. Your voice might be the reason someone else decides to act. And if you suspect ongoing fraud, contact your local authorities and organizations that help elder victims. Professionals can guide the next steps. There is more to tell about the courtroom, the coalition we built, and the small ways the community changed because one woman's mourning shifted the direction of many lives. But for now, I keep the coffee hot and the keys on the dish, and I keep working. We held a community hearing at the senior center a month after the verdict. The room was too small for the number of chairs we had borrowed. People sat on folding benches, on the windowsills, leaned against walls. There were flyers taped to the bulletin board, dates for workshops, numbers for pro bono attorneys, a chart that explained the sequence of common scams in plain language. A banner someone had painted in the basement read simply, "Keep our mornings safe." Sophia arrived late, cheeks flushed, hair pulled back in a way that made her look both younger and steadier than she had that winter morning when I first met her. She had spoken at the sentencing. She had sat in the courtroom and watched Derek's face as the judge read the counts. Now she was part of the coalition steering group. She had learned to map the terrain of her own fear so she could point others to exits. The prosecutor, whose name I still say with gratitude in the cadence of a prayer, opened the session with the kind of clarity only someone who has spent months inside redacted bank statements can bring. He sketched the mechanics of coercive generosity, how an account might be helped into a risky investment, how consent can be manufactured in the silence left by assumed authority. He said plainly that many predators are practitioners of social engineering as much of greed. They script a kindness and wait for the cue. Afterwards, we broke into circles. Volunteers who had been trained by Agent Martinez led small tables, one on recognizing early signs, one on how to read account changes, one on what to ask a lawyer. I watched Sophia move between them, listening more than speaking, then stopping at a younger woman's table to take her hand and say, "You did the right thing bringing someone with you." Eleanor sat near the window with a notebook, relearning her handwriting like a person learning to ride a bicycle again, tentative at first, then with that subtle acceleration that astonishes the rider. She told a neighbor how she had begun to reclaim the evenings, how she liked to make tea and leave the kitchen light on because it felt like a ceremony of presence. Some days she still called the bank's fraud line and asked the questions we had taught her. Aloud, it steadied her voice to say, "I need to confirm a transaction," as if the words themselves held the barrier. The coalition took on a name at the second meeting. Harbor Watch, we decided, half because it sounded like the neighborhood we had always been, and half because harbor implies refuge and attention, watching the way small vessels slip into the dark. We wrote bylaws in a single evening in the basement of the church. A simple charter insisting on survivor leadership, on confidentiality, on training standards. We committed to offering free workshops within the community and to partnering with at least 2 banks on pilot projects. That last objective felt quixotic until Agent Martinez arranged a meeting at the regional bank headquarters. The first meeting was an exercise in translation, explaining predatory patterns to compliance officers whose default was to see numbers and not faces. We brought case studies, anonymized but precise, showing how transfers were authorized and then signed off as customer initiated. We asked for 3 things: clearer flags for unusual activity, a compassionate hold protocol that would allow for immediate outreach to the account holder, and a dedicated fraud liaison who would be trained in elder abuse dynamics. The bank's legal team pushed back on the hold protocol. "We're concerned about freezing accounts incorrectly," said a woman in a gray suit. "We need to preserve access to funds for legitimate needs." She used corporate language as armor, which was fair. They had regulatory obligations. We responded with stories. I watched Jennifer, usually so private, tell a room of strangers about the night she sat awake and watched the minutes of a life drain away through an online transfer she had not authorized. Her voice was steady, not theatrical, and in that steadiness, the room shifted. Compliance officers are people who within their role can learn to be moved by a human ledger as much as a spreadsheet. We negotiated pilot parameters. The bank agreed, after weeks and follow-ups, to a 6-month trial. A team trained by Harbor Watch and Agent Martinez would be allowed to consult on flagged accounts. A hold could be placed for 72 hours when a specific pattern presented itself. Notifications would be reframed in language plain enough for a non-technical elder to understand. It wasn't everything we wanted, but it was a floor. The first time the bank called us in the quiet hours to consult on a flagged transfer, the person on the line said softly, "We may have stopped something." We breathed like a house held open after a long storm. Policy work followed. The letters I wrote to legislators felt less like pleading and more like description. Here is what happened. Here are the holes. Here is the cost, measured not only in dollars, but in mornings lost. Representative Kowalski, whose office I had only a tenuous relationship with through a mutual friend, called for a roundtable. The hearing was not the kind of sweeping lawmaking moment that gets photographed for the paper. It was small, focused, and messier. NOS-PM was a robust reporting requirements for banks that identified suspected elder exploitation and for funding to support victim navigators, people who could hold hands through the process of reclaiming accounts, filing police reports, and accessing counseling. There were procedural battles. Banks worried about false positives. Consumer advocates worried about privacy. We wrote compromise language that created thresholds for reporting and built-in protections for those accidentally flagged. We proposed funding for legal clinics that could assist survivors with quiet civil actions and restitution claims. The bill that emerged was not righteous in every clause, but it codified the idea that detection without action is cruel and that accounting can be an act of mercy. Back in the neighborhood, Harbor Watch learned what any new organization learns. People are generous and fraught in equal measure. Volunteers showed up with good intentions and had to be taught restraint, how to listen without deciding, how to keep confidences, how not to leap into rescue, and thereby reduplicate the power dynamics we opposed. We held training in the church basement on a spring evening, and at one point Sophia stood up and said quietly, "We are not here to fix everyone. We are here to make sure no one is left to fix themselves alone." There was a small applause. It felt like a foundation being poured. The legal aftermath for Derek's network continued in fits and starts. Some associates accepted plea deals that left them penniless, but quietly freed of some of the most damning charges. Others fought and dragged cases across jurisdictions. The press, which had been voracious at the start, tired. Scams proliferated in the world regardless of the convictions we won. There were new iterations, text-based schemes, romance fraud conducted through dating apps, schemes that used stolen Medicare information in ways we had not imagined. We adapted. Harbor Watch added modules to its workshops about digital literacy, about not equating politeness with legitimacy. At times, the work felt like bandaging a dike in a storm. There were days when a new story arrived in my inbox, and I felt the old panic rise, that clammy heat in the throat. On those mornings, I found I could inhabit a different posture more quickly than before. Not the person in immediate crisis, but the person who could call a line, run a checklist, and set resources in motion. I learned, the way one learns an emergency exit, to trade adrenaline for procedure. There was also tenderness. Jennifer, who had held a grieving, brittle rage for months, began coming to the workshops and teaching a simple class on boundaries, how to say no without embarrassment, how to change a bank password with another person in the room for practice, how to call a friend when you feel pressured. Her humor returned, slow and careful, and the laughter she made in a room full of people was never easy, but it was honest. She wrote that she had seen a recording of one of our sessions and that her mother had been saved from an ongoing sweep of small withdrawals by a bank teller who, watching a transfer pattern, had called Harbor Watch. "You don't know us," she wrote, "but we owe you our evenings back." I read the message in the kitchen and allowed myself a short, private smile, the way someone might after a small victory. It was never about accolades. It was about particular people getting back particular mornings. We also learned to measure success differently. There were statistics, accounts frozen, restitution ordered, volunteers trained. But the meaningful metrics were quieter. An elder who could balance a checkbook after months of being coaxed into silence. a neighbor who learned to introduce herself to a new caregiver and ask for references, a banker who changed the tone of notifications to explain a hold in human language. These were not the stuff of headlines, but they were durable. The trial aftermath continued to ripple into difficult ethical territory. Some survivors wanted to press civil suits that would require them to relive the same evidence and give testimony in public again. We supported them, but we also offered alternatives, mediated settlements that could return funds more quickly with less public exposure, counseling for those facing the prospect of public cross-examination. There were arguments about pursuing maximum restitution versus securing mental health resources for a survivor who could not sleep. The coalition leaned toward dignity over spectacle. And then there were the small, stubborn recoveries. Harold, who began tutoring a neighbor's grandson in algebra as a way to rediscover purpose. Eleanor, who took up watercolor because she liked a way the paints refused to be hurried. Sophia, who started a class called The Morning After, where she taught people how to keep their mornings when their trust had been violated. In those classes, she would ask people to sit in a circle and say one small thing they liked to do at dawn. The list of answers, gardening, coffee, looking at the ocean, knitting, became a catalog of ordinary reclamations. One autumn evening, after a day of workshops and a long meeting with the bank's pilot team, I stood on my deck and looked at the ocean. The air had a thin, honest chill that felt like a prompt. Behind me, the house was quiet. Inside, the ceramic dish held the keys, the alarm chirped once, and the radio, an old habit, played a station that no longer felt like a surveillance device, but rather a companion. I thought of how we had moved from shock to structure, from the rawness of violation to the slow architecture of safeguards. There were still nights when the memory of the knock came unbidden. Those came in fragments now, not as a single fulsome winter, but as a passing weather pattern. I met them the way Sophia had taught me to meet difficult callers, by labeling, by breathing, by seeking help where appropriate.